Imagine, if you can, a mysterious figure emerging from the shadows of biblical history. A figure who appears, performs a surprising act, and then disappears almost as quickly as he arrived. His name? Melchizedek. It's not a name we frequently hear in sermons or Bible studies. He isn't like Moses, David, or Abraham, whose stories are widely known and recounted. Melchizedek, on the other hand, appears briefly, shrouded in mystery, yet with an importance that echoes through the ages. He is mentioned in only a few verses in the Old Testament, and yet his presence is as enigmatic as it is powerful. Who is this Melchizedek? Where did he come from? And why, despite his brief mention, is he considered so important that he is remembered as a figure who foreshadows Christ himself? At this moment, it's as if we are transported to the ancient lands of Canaan, where kings and priests were not usually the same person, yet Melchizedek breaks this rule. He is presented as something beyond the ordinary, beyond what any other biblical character initially shows us. With this, we are introduced to a figure who, despite appearing for such a short time, carries within him the mystery of something much greater. The shadow of Melchizedek extends over time, setting the stage for a divine revelation to come. This is the beginning of our journey to unravel the mystery of this king-priest. When we first encounter Melchizedek in Scripture, he appears suddenly, almost as if he had always been there, waiting for the exact moment to reveal himself. It is in Genesis 14, right after a monumental battle. Abraham, the patriarch of faith, has just defeated a group of kings who had captured his nephew Lot. Tired but victorious, Abraham returns with the spoils of war, and it is at this moment that Melchizedek appears. Without any introduction or explanation, he is called the King of Salem and priest of the Most High God. There is no mention of his parents, where he came from, or how he became a priest, something unusual in the Bible where detailed genealogies are often provided. His appearance is brief, but his action is significant. He blesses Abraham. Not only does he bless him, but he also offers bread and wine, a gesture that, at first glance, seems simple but quickly begins to take on a much deeper meaning. Melchizedek is different. He is not just another king in the ancient lands, nor is he an ordinary priest. He emerges as a figure of spiritual authority, recognizing the power and purpose of God in Abraham's life. And, in a silent yet striking manner, he leaves us intrigued about what will come next. Amidst this unexpected encounter, something extraordinary happens. Abraham, the great patriarch, victorious in battle, bows down before Melchizedek. He not only accepts the blessing of this king-priest but does something even more impressive. Abraham gives Melchizedek a tithe of everything he has conquered. This gesture by Abraham is laden with meaning. In the presence of so many earthly kings and powers, he recognizes in Melchizedek a superior spiritual authority. By giving a tenth of his spoils, Abraham is not merely demonstrating gratitude. He is acknowledging the sovereignty of God manifested in Melchizedek, a king-priest who represents something much greater than any human throne. This act, this tithe, would echo through the ages. Abraham, who had already been blessed by God, now receives a special blessing through a celestial intermediary. And it is here that the figure of Melchizedek begins to rise even higher. He is the one who blesses Abraham himself, the father of nations. He is more than a mere character. He is a symbol of a promise that is yet to be fully revealed. Thus, in this moment of recognition, the importance of Melchizedek begins to unfold more deeply. What seemed like a simple encounter between two men reveals a divine purpose that transcends generations. And then, amidst this sacred exchange between Abraham and Melchizedek, something simple yet deeply symbolic happens. Melchizedek offers bread and wine. To a casual observer, it might seem like a common gesture of hospitality. After all, after a great battle, it would be natural to offer food and drink to a weary warrior. But in the spiritual context we are unraveling, this act holds a much deeper significance. The bread and wine in Melchizedek's hands seem to point to something beyond that moment. They echo into the future, to another king and priest who, many centuries later, would use the same elements to seal a new covenant with humanity. Bread and wine are universal symbols of sustenance and joy, but here, in the hands of this mysterious priest, they gain prophetic weight. It's as if Melchizedek is setting the stage for something much greater, something that transcends his own era and points directly to the Christ who would come. This gesture of offering bread and wine reminds us that the story of Melchizedek does not end there. He is a harbinger, a shadow of something much more grandiose. He points to a divine promise that would one day be fulfilled definitively, the moment when the true king and priest, Christ himself, would offer his body and blood as the greatest sacrifice. Thus, Melchizedek, with this seemingly simple act, becomes a central figure in a story that is only beginning to be revealed. But Melchizedek is not just a priest. He is also a king, the king of Salem. And this title carries profound meaning. Salem, which many scholars believe to be ancient Jerusalem, derives from the word shalom, meaning peace. Melchizedek, then, is the king of peace, a title that carries echoes of another figure who, centuries later, would be called the Prince of Peace. This combination of offices, king and priest, is uncommon, almost unprecedented. In the ancient world, these two roles rarely coexisted in the same person. Kings ruled with authority over their people, while priests dedicated themselves to serving and representing the divine will. But Melchizedek was different. He was not just a ruler, he was also the mediator between God and men. As a king, he represents authority, justice, and order. As a priest, he becomes the intermediary who offers sacrifices and intercedes on behalf of the people before God. This duality in his function is what makes him such a unique and fascinating figure. He does not limit himself to one role or the other, he embodies both. And in his union of kingship and priesthood, he foreshadows Christ, who would be both king over all creation and eternal high priest, interceding for all humanity. In this encounter with Abraham, Melchizedek does not merely represent an earthly king or a priest of his time. He is a shadow of an eternal reign and priesthood that would be fully realized in the coming of Christ. What makes Melchizedek even more intriguing is the mystery surrounding his identity. Unlike so many other biblical figures, he appears without any genealogy. There is no mention of his parents, his lineage, or his descendants. In the biblical world, where genealogies were of utmost importance, especially for priests whose authority often depended on their lineage, this absence is deeply significant. It's as if Melchizedek emerges from nowhere, without beginning and apparently without end. He does not belong to a known priestly order like the Levites who would come much later with Moses. There is no record of his ascent to the priesthood or of a lineage from which he inherited this role. He simply is a priest of the Most High God. This absence of genealogy, of beginning and end, causes Melchizedek to be seen as a timeless, almost eternal figure. And it is precisely this characteristic that the author of the letter to the Hebrews later explores when comparing him to Christ. Just as Melchizedek, Christ is the eternal high priest, not by human descent, but by a divine order that transcends time. This mystery about Melchizedek invites us to look beyond the natural, beyond what is immediate and earthly. His lack of lineage points to something deeper, the idea of an eternal priesthood, one that is not based on physical inheritance but on a direct calling from God. And so, Melchizedek, the king without genealogy, becomes a symbol of something eternal, something that only the true king and priest, Christ, could fully fulfill. The mystery of Melchizedek does not end with his appearance in Genesis. Centuries later, his name echoes again, this time in the Psalms, more precisely in Psalm 110. Here, in a messianic prophecy, he is mentioned in a surprising way: "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." This statement, attributed to the Messiah who was to come, reveals a deep connection between Melchizedek and the priesthood that Christ would embody. This single line in Psalm 110 is powerful. It not only recalls the encounter with Abraham but establishes a standard that transcends the Levitical priesthood, which was rooted in the Mosaic law and Aaron's lineage. The order of Melchizedek is different. It does not rely on descent or the rituals of the law. It is eternal, divine, and points directly to the figure of Christ. Here, the psalm is prophesying that the Messiah would not be an ordinary priest but a priest of a higher and earlier order, an order that has no beginning or end, just like Melchizedek. This unique mention makes Melchizedek more than just a figure of the past. He becomes a key, a model for understanding the eternal priesthood that Christ would come to exercise. And so, the name of Melchizedek becomes a symbol, a promise. He reminds us that the priesthood and kingship of Christ would not be temporary or limited by earthly rules but eternal and universal, just like that mysterious king-priest who blessed Abraham so many centuries before. And then, in the New Testament, Melchizedek reappears in an even more surprising way, this time in the letter to the Hebrews. It is here that the depth of his meaning is fully revealed. The author of Hebrews dedicates several chapters to comparing Melchizedek to Christ, showing how he was a clear foreshadowing of Jesus' eternal priesthood. Hebrews explains that Christ is not a priest in the Levitical order, which was tied to the law and the repeated sacrifices in the temple. Instead, he is a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, an order that does not depend on lineage or human rituals. Just as Melchizedek, Jesus did not inherit his priesthood by being a descendant of a priestly tribe but by a divine and eternal decree. The author of Hebrews points out that Melchizedek, without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, is a type of Christ, the eternal high priest who lives forever, interceding on behalf of humanity. Just as Melchizedek appeared mysteriously and blessed Abraham, Christ is the eternal priest who brings blessing and intercession for all. And not only that, Hebrews emphasizes that while the Levitical priests had to offer sacrifices repeatedly for sins, Christ, like Melchizedek, is superior. He offered a perfect sacrifice once for all. Just as Melchizedek was a priest in an order outside the traditional structures, Christ inaugurated a new way to God, no longer dependent on the repetitive rituals of the temple but on his own life and resurrection. Melchizedek, therefore, is not just a mysterious figure of the Old Testament. In the letter to the Hebrews, he becomes a mirror of Christ's priesthood, a priesthood that is eternal, unbreakable, and continues to intercede for us forever. And so, the letter to the Hebrews continues to deepen this comparison, highlighting a central truth. The priesthood of Melchizedek not only foreshadows Christ but also surpasses it in importance and duration. Here, the contrast with the Levitical priesthood becomes even more pronounced. The Levitical priests, descendants of Aaron, were many. One after another, they served in the temple, but they were limited by their own mortality. Each priest was replaced by another over generations because, like all humans, they were subject to death. Their sacrifices were also continuous and repetitive because they could never fully purify the people's sins all at once. But with Melchizedek, the picture is different. He has no recorded beginning or documented end. He emerges in history as an eternal priest, and this characteristic points directly to Christ's priesthood. Where the Levitical priesthood was temporary, Melchizedek's, and therefore Christ's, is eternal. He is the priest who will never be succeeded, whose intercession for us will never cease. Christ, then, as a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, does not offer repeated sacrifices but a single perfect sacrifice, himself. By doing so, he ends the need for any other sacrifice. He is both the priest and the sacrifice. And unlike the Levites, who entered the Holy of Holies year after year, Christ entered heaven itself once for all to intercede for us before the Father. This comparison reveals the absolute superiority of Christ's priesthood. He is not limited by time, rituals, or a mortal lineage. Just as Melchizedek was greater than the priests of his time, Christ, the true eternal priest, is greater than any priesthood that has ever existed. His work is complete, and his intercession is eternal. And so, we reach the great conclusion. Melchizedek, the mysterious king-priest who briefly appears in Abraham's story, is not just an enigmatic figure. He is a powerful foreshadowing of Christ, a reflection of the priesthood to come, pointing to the one who would be both king and priest, both ruler and mediator. The significance of Melchizedek goes far beyond his brief encounter with Abraham. He represents something that would only be fully revealed in Jesus Christ, the eternal, perfect, and unchanging priesthood. While earthly priests under the law offered sacrifices repeatedly and served for a limited time, Christ, as a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, offers the perfect sacrifice, his own life, once for all. He does not serve in an earthly temple but in the very heavenly throne, and his intercession never ends. Melchizedek, without a recorded beginning or end of days, becomes a symbol of the eternity of Christ. Where human priesthood failed in its imperfection and limitation, Christ's priesthood is final and absolute. And so, Melchizedek helps us understand a central truth. Christ is not just a priest among many but the definitive high priest, the only one capable of perfectly reconciling us with God. In the end of our journey, we see that Melchizedek was not just a historical figure. He was a reflection, a shadow of the one who was to come, Jesus, the King of righteousness, the Prince of Peace, the eternal high priest who reigns forever. And it is through Christ that the promise made to Abraham is fully fulfilled, bringing blessing not only to him but to all nations. Thus, the story of Melchizedek does not end with him. It finds its fullness in Christ, the true and eternal King-Priest.